In this talk, I want to look at the period 1930 to 1980, which takes us up to the period when I wrote the lectures, 1982, and I was thus reflecting really on my own academic life and the period up to the end really of the structural period. Structuralism, as I explained in the last talk, was an ahistorical, anti-diffusionist paradigm which started in the 1890s and it lasted about 100 years. And it can be divided into a first very anti-historical phase, the functionalist phase, associated with people like Malinowski, and then a second phase which has many different streams in it, including some return, as I'll talk about in this lecture, to a much more historical, evolutionary, even Victorian kind of approach. In fact, anthropology split during this period because the functionalist, structural functionalist, which was the work of people like Meyer Fortes, Evans Pritchard, thread continued, and there was an even more ahistorical period in structuralism or structuralism, in other words, the French work associated with people like Lévi-Strauss, Louis Dumont, and others in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. So one strand was still very anti-historical, or ahistorical to a certain extent, whereas there was also a rise of a new form of evolutionism alongside this, as I'll explain. What happened was that in the 1950s, there emerged, particularly in history, but also in anthropology, a return to a very evolutionary model, namely Marxist anthropology, archaeology, and so on, or neo-Marxist. You find this in archaeology in the work of Gordon Childe, and later Graham Clark and others. For example, Vogt, in his History of Anthropology, writes, archaeology always had been in a favourable position for uniting historic and evolutionary process. It was fitting then that in 1936 an archaeologist, Gordon Childe, generated a new interest in the evolution of culture by describing the great subsistence and technological revolutions which advanced man's social and mental life and added measurably to his capacity to survive. And he had an influence in anthropology, particularly on Jack Goody and others. In anthropology, the late Radcliffe Brown, the late Malinowski were much closer to social evolutionism than they had been in their early reactions to diffusionism. But a more dramatic example in anthropology was in the work of Julian Stewart and Lynn White, who reintroduced an evolutionary perspective into American anthropology in a series of attacks on the prevailing anti-historical trends of their times. It had been always realized that although you might try and avoid origins, history, and so on because they were unknowable, they were important, and one all through the history of the disciplines there'd been an acceptance that if we had known or knew about the past, we would take it into account. Robert Lowy, in his History of Anthropology, writes that chronology was always present, it just tended to be disregarded. We have seen that scholars differ widely in their chronological tastes. Some are content with vague indications, others insist on precise time fixations. Still others profess reliance on only written records or even disdain history on principle. But even the extremists, and this is the important point, smuggle a chronology into their systems for the simple reason that the time category is inescapable, hence the need for making our chronology as accurate as we can. There were background reasons, and throughout these talks I've talked about the political effects on academic and intellectual systems. The threat to functionalism and structural functionalism. Structural functionalism, by the way, is functionalism but giving more weight to social structure and other things outside the functioning, direct functioning of a system. The threat to these stable portrayals of social systems were growing, particularly in the 1930s. After the war, during the war, after the war, you could look at functional models holding things together. But in the 1930s, things began to fall apart again. The Great Depression, the rise of Hitler, and a feeling of loss of faith and confidence. Vogt summarizes this. The economic depression of the 30s was especially critical in drawing attention to systematic contradictions, conflicts, and disorganization. The Depression and World War II that followed were profound events which shook the faith of the social scientists in the reality of functional and systematic integration. This was a time when the emphasis on static, structural, functional relationships began to falter, as anthropologists increasingly took note of the accelerated rate of change which the industrial and pre-industrial worlds experienced in the wake of their mechanization. So not only was there loss of faith and confidence within Europe and America because of economic events and the Second World War, but it's also, now looking back, obvious that the balance of power was again shifting. Britain's place had been challenged as the leading economic power, but it was in the aftermath of the Second World War, of course, that it lost its empire. India, to begin with, the greatest part of it, 1947, and then much of the rest of it within the next 10 years. So the idea of anthropology and other disciplines as providing analysis of what held things together could not really be easily sustained after the 30s, 40s. And so in the 50s and 60s you get a new interest in time, change, and so on. For instance, Evans Pritchard very strongly reacted against his teachers Radcliffe Brown and Malinowski, and in the 1950s set out a new agenda for the role of history in anthropology. He was himself trained as a historian, and I was very influenced by his trying to bring together history and anthropology. Edmund Leach was very dismissive of functionalist, straight functionalist views, introducing a time element, even if it was a pendulum swinging back and forth in his well-known study of Highland Burma. Meyer Fortes introduced an idea of circulatory time, social time, into his models. Victor Turner introduced the idea of conflict, movement, drama, and so on. So you find a shift within anthropology towards more interest in time, and likewise in history you get the rise particularly of Marxist history in the journal Past and Present, classic works like The Making of the English Working Class by Edward Thompson, and the gradual absorption of the Marx-Weber evolutionary models. The change, again, was against a background of political and technological changes of a rapid kind growing after the Second World War. The old social orders within Europe and America appeared to be giving way. Everything was changing. The relations between the classes was changing rapidly, between the sexes, between the young and the old, the growing pop culture of the 50s, and the relationship between Europe, America, and the rest of the world was also rapidly changing. The final retreat of empire, as I have mentioned, formal empire of the European nations was occurring, and the Cold War was leading to a struggle between two ideologies. And technology was again on the move. In a sort of way, looking back, it looks as if the great rush of technologies, which gave a sense of progress to the Victorians, had slowed down somewhat towards the end of the 19th century. The changes were not perhaps so dramatic between, say, 1890 and 1940, but then the period between 1940 or a bit earlier and 1960 saw a very considerable rise and change in technologies. In medicine and hygiene, there's the major revolution in antibiotics and the development of new vaccines and so on. So medicine is revolutionized. Probably the largest development and most important in the last several hundred years occurred in that 1930 to 1960 period, the discovery of DNA and so on. There was a huge sudden leap in communications technology, the radio, and then particularly television, and the spread of the telephone. And the weapons of destruction suddenly grew in an order of magnitude with the exploding of the atom bomb and then the development of the hydrogen bomb. One was taken onto a new level of the possibilities of destruction. Likewise, after the Second World War, after the doldrums of the 1930s, suddenly the economies began to grow again. Germany revived, parts of Europe, but particularly America and Japan. America was surging forward economically after the war, and appearing to be and was becoming the great dominant force on the planet. Exploration, although the exploration of the surface of the Earth had been achieved earlier and not much was being added, there were two new big areas, the seabed and how it worked, tectonic plates and so on, and space as a new frontier. So they were, after the war, and this was the period I was being brought up in my own life, I chronicled the new confidence from, well, the middle of the 1950s through the 1960s. As Macfarlane famously put it, you never had it so good. Things seem to be on the improve, and it's at this time that the neo-evolutionary theoretical frameworks become more and more convincing. Weber and Marx become the two exciting sociologists who are regarded highly by everyone, and particularly anthropologists and historians. And sociology develops with developmentalism in population studies and demography. There's a new interest in the stages of economic demographic change, the Malthusian revolutions, and then the counter theories, which in the works of people like Esther Bozrach suggests that things are on the move, improving, that there is some kind of law of technological improvement which will overcome the earlier and more dire version of Malthus. So the reintroduction of evolutionary perspectives in the 1960s is described, for instance, by Vogt. There is a reintroduction of an evolutionary perspective in American ethnology which spurred a rash of efforts to classify and arrange political systems in a graded succession, moving from simplicity to complexity. This political evolutionism perspective was stimulated in part by the parallel interest of prehistorians in the rise of the ancient urban civilizations. There was a new optimism and confidence. Vogt, for example, writes again, on concluding his survey of the primitive world and its transformations, Robert Redfield in 1953 pointed with optimism to the enlargement of human wisdom, morality, and character that accompanied the human experiment. A pre-engagement with purposive development once again directed the attention of anthropologists to judgments about the values of cultures. Looking backward through the prism, this is all Vogt, through the prism of advancement, anthropologists appeared to align themselves with the intellectual ideas of former developmentalists, especially the humanists. He continues this and links it to a new form of domination by the West, by America in particular, a new kind of imperialism, not the old land-grabbing imperialism of the British Empire, but economic imperialism. In other words, opening up markets, gaining a large share of the wealth of the world through economic forces. Vogt describes this in the 1950s and 60s as a re-engagement with purposive development, once again directed the attention of anthropologists to judgments about the value of cultures. The problem increased as governments moved ever deeper into power politics on a global scale. The growing involvement of the US government in overseas research for counterinsurgency purposes, the Vietnam run-up to the Vietnam War and so on, gave a new mission to certainly one thread of anthropology, which was widely criticized, of course, but basically, whereas the British Empire had needed to know about the peoples it was subduing and taxing for one purpose, the Americans needed to know about the threats of communism and how to pursue their economic and other goals with the help of social scientists. There was also, as there had been in the Great Victorian period, a resurgence of interest in detailed information, which was rising in quantity and quality. For example, there was an archival revolution in history. I was involved in this, the opening up of local records and public records, and a possibility of getting first-hand knowledge about past societies in a new way. I was part of this very exciting development in local history and so on in the 50s, 60s. So there was a revolution in history and historical documentation. There was a great extension of the intensive methods of anthropology, the use of film, photography, and so on, rising in the 50s, 60s. In archaeology, there were entirely new and revolutionary methods, particularly radiocarbon dating and dendrochronology, dating from trees. And in sociology, there was the use of more intensive methods and the use of computers to improve the quality of information. There was, and I know it because I lived through it myself and was part of it, a general feeling of expansion and excitement. The economy was expanding, the academic world, the founding of new universities, suddenly a new confidence and wave. The world, we felt, at that time could be modified and improved. It was expanding. It was a time for large schemes, large conferences, large budgets, large projects. Some of them not very sane, but all exciting. People writing books like Norbert Elias on the civilizing process. Lawrence Stone's book on marriage and love was chronicling the development of modern sentiment and so on, and this was happening among the psychohistorians and people like Edward Shorter and so we were on the move. Modern human beings were more tolerant, emotionally involved and so on than our ancestors. Of course, throughout this narrative, as I've explained, things don't just go in one direction, they go up and down. The confidence of the 1960s, certainly in Britain and Europe, hit a new buffer or barrier in the early 1970s with the oil crisis, with the Vietnam War, with economic recession, with worries about proliferation of weaponry. So there was some loss of confidence. But the communications revolution continued, particularly the rise of the computer and later obviously much later, the internet. And exploration continued, scientific development, particularly in the medical sciences and biology, was rushing on. And so you get simultaneously a slowing in the French structural approach of Lévi-Strauss and so on, looking at societies as if they were archaeological layers, as Edmund Leach puts it, without too much interest in history, and also a growing interest in large schemes of a historical kind. It's quite interesting to compare this new evolution with the old. Has it managed to avoid the weaknesses of imperial evolutionism, the moral arrogance and so on, which marred the earlier vision? Writing in the early 1980s, in the field I knew about, the field of the social history of the family, I felt at that time that actually historians had returned to a rather unpleasant version of Victorian moralizing. They tended, at least some of them who wrote about the family, like Stone and Shorter and others, to suggest that our ancestors were living in a pre-modern period in which life was nasty, brutish and short, emotions were suppressed, and people were basically inferior to us. And we had emerged in the 18th, 19th century into a more rational and feelingful world. So the same pushing of people backwards for theoretical purposes seemed to be occurring to me, and I tried to do my part in destabilizing that view. But what is really interesting, and looking back perhaps a bit more now, 30 years later, is that what I did accept were certain things. One was that the stages of societies, which have been laid out basically by the 18th century and then revised in the 19th century, was the way I looked at the history of human societies. When I lectured to my students, my Part 1 and Part 2 students, I often fitted the lectures into four great stages: the hunter-gatherer peoples who lived by just off the surface of the earth until roughly 10,000 years ago, the first domestication of plants and animals and the tribal societies, roughly, because these periods go on for a very long time, between 30,000 and up to 10,000 years ago, the first civilizations, as we describe them, with writing and states and crafts and so on, from about 10,000 years ago, and then modern industrial bourgeois societies. So it was a kind of developmental framework I was thinking in. And the other thing I was quite heavily influenced by was the Marxist Weberian theory of stages of societies, and particularly the growth of capitalism from feudalism. And another part of it, which was the idea that the capitalist the capitalist individualist modern civilization emerged in one part of the world first, that is in Europe, and then spread elsewhere, and in particular from England, as Marx and Weber had thought. And so I was part of a movement in the 1960s, starting in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, which was concerned with the origins of the modern world and saw it in terms of the first development of a modern kind of society, capitalism, in England and Europe. And so during that period, particularly in history, you got a lot of works which were a kind of muted evolutionism. You might start with a very extreme one, which was Rostow's Anti-Communist Manifesto, which was the subtitle of it. So it wasn't communist, but it was anti-communist, and it still had the same kind of idea of stages of development, stages of economic growth in the early 1950s, which saw societies taking off one after the other. First of all, Britain, and then Germany and France, and then America, and then Japan, and then that was about it by the time he wrote his book. And then you can fill in later takeoffs from that. And you had in the 1960s, 70s, lots of books of a very exciting, interesting kind. People like David Landers' book Unbound Prometheus, the books by John Hall, Michael Mann, and others on the European miracle and the rise of capitalism in various forms, and E.L. Jones's titled book, European Miracle, and later Jared Diamond's book on how civilizations developed from very early origins. So you had a whole wave of books looking at the European miracle. And these were kind of evolution light, as it might be stated nowadays, of another kind. This, I think, fits with the growing gap, as I've mentioned, between America, where much of this theory was taking place, and to a certain extent Europe and Japan, and the rest of the world. The gap between the inequality of the world at this time was quite considerable between the developed countries and the so-called undeveloped nations, and was growing greater as the technologies surged ahead. The effects of all this made one feel in the West that we led the way, and this is a great period of aid and development and attempts to try and bring other societies up to our level, and to fight off the alternative vision, which was communism as a way of achieving this. So there's a lineal view of history with, again, the West ahead. And it reaches the point where I'll end this particular reinterpretation of the lectures as I gave them, symbolically in 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of communism in the Soviet Union, and already earlier the abandonment to a large extent of the Maoist experiment in 1979 in China, though the West didn't really realize what was happening to a large extent in the 80s in China. But basically the great threat of communism to the West was over, and so 1989 is symbolically the triumph of the West, which was the title of various books and so on at the time, and was celebrated by someone who in a way was situated. He was working for the RAND Corporation, a developmental capitalist organization in America. He was Japanese by origin, Fukuyama. And in his article, which came into a book, The End of History, he celebrated the fact that although we could look at the development of civilizations up to now, the West had triumphed. Capitalism had triumphed, individualism had triumphed, America had triumphed, and history was ended. It was over. Nothing more remained really to be done except to increase the affluence and security of the world from then on. It seemed a golden moment. But history didn't end in 1989, and in a postscript I'll talk about the events to a certain extent after that, and my own work elaborating what was originally written in 1982, as I say, and is the substance of what I've been talking about here. Thank you.